Alan Wade Luciuk, February 27th, 1964. Spiritwood, Saskatchewan. Spirit would be about an hour and a half northeast of Saskatoon. My father was a principal in the system after he left the Army, and he was the youngest principal in Saskatchewan at the time, and that was his first sort of posting, and I came along. The bulk of it would be in Saskatchewan, specifically Saskatoon, Sturgis. That would be sort of my area of calling, if you will. A couple, but they're not mentionable on tape, I think. The Mitchelluk boys always just called me Captain Lou, or when I was playing in Saskatoon, Cat, for some reason. I used to be able to sneak up on players as a defenseman before the knee brace caused all the squeaks and letting people know I was coming. A lot of friends were playing box lacrosse in Saskatoon at the time. This was at the sort of tail end of the 70s, 78, 79. I was playing a lot of football and hockey and a variety of sports. I always like to try different sports, biathlon, things of that nature. And then my buddies started saying, hey, why don't you come out and play lacrosse? But of course, I was so involved with so many other things, it just didn't seem to happen. And unfortunately, when they finally sold me on the game, box lacrosse was dying in Saskatoon, and the only game that was sort of on the horizon was field lacrosse for the most part. So although I've had a chance to play a little bit of box at camps and things, it just ended up being field as the number one sport for me. But the real key was the stick. The stick and the history actually caught me. I have two passions in my life, history and lacrosse, or lacrosse and history. I did it pretty well one-on-one. But my real passion in my current line of work is history. But it was the stick, the uniqueness of the stick that truly made it stand out from all other sports. You know, a hockey stick is basically, at the time, before you were allowed to have the Russian curve, as they called it, and those kinds of things, it was just a piece of wood, a lumber really, but the uniqueness of the stick, the traditional pockets, the leather, you know, taking a beer bottle and shaving down your traditional, you know, stick and those kinds of things were absolutely intriguing to me. And of course, as I say, as a history teacher, currently, and back then a passion for history, I was fascinated by the Jesuit missionaries and Brebeuf and the idea of the creator's game and the stick, Lacrosses, and those kinds of things. And then it just evolved over time. For example, became very interested in the evolution of the game in what is called the Northwest Territories at the time. And the driving sort of impetus for lacrosse in the West was a result of two things. The Homestead Act of 1874, which brought thousands and thousands. Saskatchewan was actually the largest province in Western Canada. And people were coming from Ontario and back east and Montreal and all over the place. And they were coming for the free 160 acres for a $10 registration fee, but they brought the game with them. And then with the completion of the railroad in 1885, it became a game that was played up and down the rail lines. And the railway determined the spread of lacrosse in Western Canada. So these are sort of seminal things. 1884, the first lacrosse team, and at the time it was all field lacrosse, of course, 1884 in Prince Albert, for example. And if I may sidebar here, one of my favorite restaurants is Fat Burger in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, because my grandfather owned 3 different stores in the city of Prince Albert. And in the Fat Burger, there's a booth with a picture of my grandfather's store and the first lacrosse team. So I insist with the manager immediately, I have to sit in that booth or I'm not eating here, and they clear the deck for me. And that sort of connection I find very, very powerful. So these teams start emerging from Regina, Saskatoon, Rosthern, all over the various bits and pieces of the province as a result of the massive amounts of immigration that come to the Northwest Territories. Then teams spring up in Edmonton, Medicine Hat, and it spreads throughout the West as a result of the Homestead Act and, of course, the railroads. So for me, this is that history that brings the story of lacrosse to life, you know, in the West, certainly. I guess as a player, being part of the team that after 100 years of drought, if you will, in terms of winning a medal at a national competition. Being a part of that team was a special time. And that was the Ross Victory Cup in Nanaimo, winning bronze for the first time. And then after that, we won silver, and after that, gold, and it is the result of some of the development that had gone on in Saskatchewan, specifically in a place called Sturgis, Saskatchewan, and a couple of brothers, Steve and Lyle Luciuk, for example, that took to the game and were able to work their way all the way up to a national team. And ultimately, they became the foundation of a very tight program that allowed us to be very successful at the national level for a change. As a player, a real turning point, we would play internally within Saskatchewan quite a bit, but the real change came as a result of a push from a fellow in Calgary named Mr. Jim Burke. And Jim proposed to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta teams that we introduce a bit of a league, if you will. And it was a very interesting idea because in Western Canada, as I've mentioned in terms of the railroad and things like that, we fight geography. And the lack of local competition really and truly is 6 to 9 hours away. If anything, Edmonton would be 5 hours from, say, Saskatoon, but 8 from Regina. So it was a very difficult thing. So we came together under Jim's leadership here, and we came up with a format that we thought would work. And because of that length of time, Saskatchewan sort of became the middle ground. So the teams from Edmonton and Calgary would come to Saskatoon and Regina, but the distance for Winnipeg was too far, for them to go all the way and skip over Saskatchewan. So Winnipeg would come and play in Regina and Saskatoon. They would play most of their games against the Alberta teams and only 1 or 2 games against the Saskatoon teams. Then our job was to go to Winnipeg. The Alberta teams would stay at home, and we worked out an interlocking season, and it was, for me as a player, probably the most instrumental in my own development, because you get to a certain level, but if you don't break out of that level of competition, and I think truly having the opportunity to coach with Gary Gate on the national team, junior national team, and then act as a manager for a second junior national team, what I noticed was Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba kids, they can play, but they just don't have that level of competition that allows them to handle the pressures of the world level or even, for some, the national level. So the key is having the opportunity to get high-level competition. And I played against some great players, Jim obviously being one of them, but so many guys from Edmonton and Calgary and Winnipeg, Tom Parker, Keith McLennan, absolutely amazing player. And if he had grown up in Toronto, he would have been on national teams left and right. But again, because of his geographic location and level of competition, he wasn't technically noticed. Denny Johnson, another fellow, one of the first from Saskatchewan ever to go to the United States and play. Just a phenomenal athlete, and that's how I became a better player, by covering guys like Keith and guys like Denny Johnson. And if we had that level of competition all the time, maybe we would have been a little bit more successful. And I think it's still a problem here in the West, Midwest, I should say. Well, winning the Prime Minister's Award for teaching of history, so that's a professional as opposed to a lacrosse thing, but it's seminal in the sense that my passion for history is shared through lacrosse, and lacrosse through into my work life, if you will. But having said that, the Queen's Jubilee Medal as recognition for work that I had done both for the CLA and the SLA and lacrosse in general. I guess those would be sort of 2 of the more significant highlights, if you will. I think for me it's the equipment. The changes that I've witnessed in terms of equipment and that evolution through there. The move from the wooden stick to, we used to call it Tupperware, the plastic, and the Super Light 2, which was just a horrible, horrible stick, but it was light and it allowed you to change the mesh and do some interesting things. So I guess the evolution of sticks to offset heads to pinches and all sorts of neat mesh kits, I guess that for me would be what I would consider the biggest change. The stick itself, equipment in general, how much better protected you are from the old turtleback where you still could get cross-checked and you'd feel it, to some of the, the high-impact plastic and helmet changes, of course. I'm also a football coach and of course concussions and all that sort of thing. The amount of work that's gone into helmets in Canada and the United States, the Cascades and things of that nature. So the protection in general, I think some of my buddies who used to play goal used to put an extra telephone book behind their pads, when they played box, so that they just wouldn't feel as much of the shots on the tops of their legs and things like that. So I guess equipment would be the biggest change for me. I've become really fascinated with the way the game has expanded, both in our own country and overseas. I've been lucky enough to coach lacrosse from basically the Arctic Circle with a man named Russ Shepard, all the way down to Venezuela. I was working in South America for a couple of years and took a bag of sticks and started a 6-team little league in just off the coast of Venezuela. And the ability to see the game get picked up. I know the Americans have done a lot of work just because of their exposure, but watching teams like Japan come along, and I think the growth of the game in general has absolutely fascinated me. The last event in Israel, for example. So seeing how the game has, a traditional First Nations game in our country has sort of webbed its way out. And of course we have, depending on the statistics you look at, up to 75 countries currently playing men's field. I find that a very interesting sort of evolution of the game. And the other thing that really fascinates me is the move to an Olympic status. And I think once that occurs, I think there's going to have to be a change in the way the game is looked at internally in our own country and certainly internationally. The money that will flow in for athlete development and things like that are going to really change as a result of what I call that Olympic status. So I'm really kind of watching that, the rules and how they're being manipulated and changed, some in my opinion for the good and some not as comfortable with, but I think those are going to be big changes that I would see coming out as a result of the move to Olympic status. In 1987, I'd finished my 2 degrees, history degree and teaching degree, and was looking for a position as a teacher. And a number of places sort of had contacted me to teach in their districts, but the one that intrigued me the most was a place called Sturgis, Saskatchewan. It was about 3 hours from everywhere, almost on the Manitoba border. So it was quite a distance from sort of the traditional areas of lacrosse for me, which was an issue because, as I said, my passions were history and lacrosse, or lacrosse and history. So I decided to take the position, and during the interview, I actually said, would I be allowed to create a lacrosse team? And they, what's lacrosse? And I said, well, it's a traditional game played in our country. It's actually, one of our official sports and a variety of different things of that nature. And they sort of, well, I suppose, but if it keeps the kids active, I think we can allow that to happen. So I said, all right, I'll consider your position. And even before I was just driving home, that 3-hour drive, they had already phoned back to Saskatoon, to my home, and said, we're offering you the position, we want you, and you should be starting here next year, and et cetera, et cetera. So I proceeded to take the position, spent the summer playing lacrosse, but in one of those Western Canadian tournaments, one of the last tournaments of the season in August, I was doing sort of the ding-dong check, which I sort of became known for, if you will, and blew out my knee, tore the anterior cruciate and required massive surgery, 17 screws and plates and the whole works. But it also entailed the recovery of the time that it was a hip to toe cast. So I started teaching on the second floor of Sturgis Composite High School in a full cast, barely able to move. I'd been out of the hospital for about 5 days. I would sweat just getting from the first floor to the top floor, let alone being prepared to teach, and I lost a lot of that prep time just sitting in a hospital. Variety of problems there. I almost bled to death. So I was not in good shape. All the sutures had let go. And so needless to say, my arrival in Sturgis was not a good one, shall we say. Now, of course, the first thing that's in my classroom is my stick. And as I said, the stick draws people. It's an interest point. And as a result of that stick, there were a lot of great athletes. Small town Saskatchewan, like many places, have great hockey players, and we've put a number of kids in the NHL and several from around the Sturgis area, Trent Yanni and all those types, and of course Wendell Clark, and was just down the road, and so you have all that hockey tradition. So the kids were not shy from a little body contact or anything like that, but there was really not much to do. You played hockey in the winter and you played ball in the summer, and that was it. So I understood, when you start a team, the first thing you have to do is you have to make the sexiest uniform you can. So I actually changed the school colors to orange and blue because my team was Syracuse, and of course the Gate brothers had been playing there, and so changed the lacrosse team's colors to an orange and blue jersey, ordered the sharpest jerseys I could find and draped those over the desks, and of course kids, well, what is that, and what's that, and what's that? And of course I had a ball and I'd be teaching something in history, but of course with the lacrosse ball, can we see that? Oh, sure. So I tried to, if you will, set a hook into the kids in the community, in the school, and I also realized you have to pick the right kids. I don't recall what the term is that the CLA uses, a key person in every community to sort of start something up. Well, I knew you had to pick some key athletes, and then they'll bring their friends. So as a result, teaching mostly grade 12, 11, 10, not so much 9, but basically having the opportunity to be exposed to, as a composite school, kids used to come for hours and hours and hours. And some of my greatest athletes worked on dairy farms. And they would get up at 5 in the morning and ride a bus to another town to get on another bus just to get to school. Some of these kids rode the bus for 2.5 hours and in 50 below and all sorts of things. So they had these tremendous journeys just to come to school. And such is the life in rural Saskatchewan. And these great athletes, I lost a lot of them because, nope, your job is to milk cows. And some of them were phenomenal athletes but just couldn't participate. But as sort of I said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to try this game. So I started some winter try-it nights, got the right kids in. Kids were looking for things to do anyway, so it allowed them to sort of experience the stick and do those kinds of things. And there were a huge number of great players that came out of there. Brian Kopech a little bit later on, but Stephen Lyle would probably be two of those key kids that sort of came out. And they didn't know which end of the stick was up, basically. So taught them all the basics of it. And they weren't 100% sure they really wanted to play. Hockey was their focus, and that's all they kind of wanted to do. But just sort of wore them down to a point where they decided, okay, we'll give it a spin. But hard work ethic in these, I hate to say it, farm kids, and farm strong. I remember driving along and kids were pushing giant 1,500-pound round bales around, in the fields for fun. And I'm like, well, okay, I don't need a gym or a weight room. That farm strength. And these farm tough kids. So as a result, we worked very hard throughout the winter and into the following spring. And we were given the opportunity at the time, the Saskatchewan Lacrosse Association had sort of 2 junior championships. They called it the rural division and the urban division. So teams in the bigger centers played themselves, and we would play various other smaller towns in Saskatchewan. So we arrived at the first championship, and nobody knew about us or anything of that nature. But of course, I'd put in a significant amount of time with the kids, and we sort of had any infraction was an automatic 10 push-ups. It didn't matter what you did, you dropped the ball or whatever it is. And the kids kind of got into that sort of vibe, if you will. And it wouldn't work today, but at the time it worked. And these kids just absolutely destroyed all the rural teams. And the only loss we took that year was to the urban team. So as a result, we won the first championship. The kids sort of had the lacrosse bug at that point. And as a result, the following year, they waived the division and it was an open division. But now these kids had a year under their belt. We worked hard. I set up a winter fun league. They had jerseys. We played all winter. We played all summer. We were ready to go and won the second year. Third year comes along, same dedication, kids working very hard. The Mitchellucks was unique because the open age categories allowed them to play for the first time together. In hockey, they were always kept apart, but they really enjoyed that, and they fed off each other. They knew where each other were at all times on the field, and as a result, they start winning the first, second in scoring and things of that nature. And then ultimately in that third year, we win the third, a fourth, a fifth, and we're off to the races. As a result, after 5 years, I left Sturgis. We had already started a senior men's team. The contribution of a lot of the kids that came out of the Sturgis program formed the basis of that senior program that went on to win, after 100 years, several of the medals at the senior ranks as well. The Mitchelluck boys themselves were, as a result of our performance, the year that nationals were held, I was able to take the Sturgis team, this high school team, from a town of 750 people, and I think that counted with all the cats and the cattle and everything else that was in the area, 750 people, and we ended up taking them to nationals and playing in the gold medal game against Oshawa, the Oshawa Blue Knights, a storied program in our country, of course, and this is my first exposure to men like Stan Cockerton, Terry Lloyd, and basically, okay, it's on. Now, a town of 750 versus Oshawa, and the boundaries around Oshawa are fluid, shall we say. So a town of 500,000, let's say. And we give them a heck of a game. They barely beat us by, in fact, we were leading at half and all the way through, and they only beat us by 2 goals, which in field lacrosse is not huge. And it was a hard-fought battle right to the end. And as a result of that performance, Steve and Lyle were clearly recognized by Terry and Stan, who were organizing some of the national teams at that point, that, oh, there's some potential talent here. And as a result, they made the junior team that played in Long Island that next year and a half. So as a result of those performances, I always used Ontario as one of the guiding programs, how you stack up in the country based on how you come up against Ontario. BC's very good programs, don't get me wrong, but we'd had some success against BC over different points in time. But it was always nice, as a coach, I always sort of, if we can get into some good games with Ontario, those are games I remember. We tied them in Edmonton a couple of years ago, and two losses to Ontario. That's kind of my milestone marker in terms of our own performance, if you will. David was a tremendous athlete. He had played a lot of box, and obviously I'd worked with him on the field side of things. As I say, a tremendous athlete. He's, has the physical stature and the tools to do it. But a game that it comes down to that game sense, that playing at those super high levels. And as a result, he was able to perform well enough to crack the roster for that first junior team in 2002 that played in Townsend State. So that was the team I was involved with Gary. And of course, he was able to, play, but just not quite at the same level as the kids coming out of Ontario and British Columbia due to that high level of competition they always received. But he performed well enough that the coach of Cornell asked if he could speak with me, and I just said, sure, yeah, what do you need? Is it okay if we speak with David and maybe look at something for him at Cornell? And as a result, David was introduced, he went through the whole process and agreed to go to Cornell. And again, it took a couple of years. The Americans have a different system, how they like to redshirt all your first years, and even Paul and Gary Gait didn't play in their first year, and Roy Simmons is still sort of kicking himself, or Roy Simmons Jr., still kicking himself for that little guffaw. But David took a year or two to, just to learn that level of competition. But in his sort of sophomore year to junior year, all of a sudden, he took off and was in the running for the Tawasin Award at one point, and just dominated the game. So I think, as I had mentioned earlier, I think it's that level of competition that we still struggle with here in the prairies, that has held back some of those kids. But we've had interest from Virginia. In fact, Lyle Michaluk, Virginia was interested in him, but it just, kids didn't go to the United States from Saskatchewan at that time. Upon returning from the World Championships in 2002, I realized that we just don't have that level of competition. So I decided to form a team called the Scorpions, Saskatoon Scorpions. And the purpose of that program was to work in the off-season on their skills, their techniques, all the basics, then work it up to basically a college level offense and defense systems with 4 or 5 slide packages and offensive sets. I basically tried to create an American team here in the middle of Canada. Then took those teams to the United States. I do believe in learning from your enemy. Napoleon once said, fight your enemy once, defeat him, fight him twice, teach him. So I figured, okay, we'd lost to the Americans. They're the ones that we have to be able to defeat if we want to be successful at a national team level and ultimately as a world or potentially an Olympic sort of run. So by touring the kids through the United States and playing in a variety of US tournaments, we took the best of American field, combined it with the best of Canadian box to create that hybrid Canadian player. And that allowed us to become more and more successful at the junior level because we were running sort of American-style offenses against teams that were used to sort of playing box on a field or certainly the Ontario teams, that was never the case because of the exposure to the United States. But it allowed us to get an edge on even some of the BC teams, some of the teams in Manitoba, Alberta, and certainly in the Maritimes. So by creating that hybrid player, we were able to become more successful, if you will. Now, John and his brother, both excellent players. There are so many people in the game, and with John, his father was an absolute, just a brilliant man, raised those boys so well, humble, became the president of Sask Lacrosse, and was really in the heyday of the game in many ways. As a result of that, John just was one of those dominant players, and when he played with his brother, who was a couple years younger, also an amazing athlete, they were just a force to be dealt with. And the reality is, of course, he was playing football and many other sports, a great hockey player as well, but there wasn't at the time a future in lacrosse. And I think that's been a problem in our country. Certainly it's been helped by the professional leagues. David even played in the Professional Field League down in the States and has had various, the wings and things like that. But it's that exposure to a professional level that just wasn't there for John. And of course, with his leg, he was able to boot the heck out of any ball, CFL ball or NFL ball. And now he's back. He's a Saskatchewan Rough Rider, so it's always nice to see the boys come home. But just a phenomenal athlete and gives back to the game still. And it's just nice to have that level of talent. As I've said, it's about the competition in our province. They're not noticed. If he had grown up in Ontario, British Columbia, who knows where he's at. Colby Zaff ended up playing beaches and ultimately into the pros. Regina kid, again, just a gymnast. I actually saw him get hit, and he did a complete somersault in the air, land on his feet, run down and score a goal. Just good athletes, but again, it's that level of competition that has really hurt, I think, the development of some of the potentially talented kids here in the Midwest anyway. Yeah. I guess you asked earlier about those greatest moments coaching and things. I think it's been the ability to help kids hone their skills, but their individual work ethic that comes out of a prairie kid, if I can use that term, allows them to become very successful. Just 2 years ago, a kid out of the Scorpions program and the local SWAT program scored a goal in the NCAA championships. These kinds of exposure points that have allowed kids to become so much better and then ultimately, with their work ethic, take the game to other levels has been truly a powerful experience as a coach. And that I've enjoyed, if you will. It's where they go after you've worked with them that it's exciting to see. And that's probably the biggest sort of thing I would say as a goal as a coach. But the ability to meet people over the roughly 30 years of involvement in the game, and coming from a small organization, you do everything, right? So I've been president to sector chairs and coaching directors and things of that nature. But it was also the work that I was exposed to at the Canadian Lacrosse Association that I found really interesting, because you have a collection of people, for the most part, that have no kids involved at any point now, and yet they're giving back to this game. They've been hooked by the game. And I met so many fascinating people and their willingness to give back to the game. Stu Begg, Tom Ingle, Stan Cockerton, Terry Lloyd. There's so many neat people that have given something back way above and beyond that I've seen people even do in other sports, if that makes sense. So lacrosse is really a unique Canadian game, obviously, but it gets into your blood, and I think that is the thing that really makes it so unique. I had a chance to play football, and I had a chance to play other sports and things like that, but this is the only game that gave me a natural high while playing it, to the point where it was incredibly difficult to put the stick down as a player. I've never liked coaching. I did it because I wanted to share the game and give other kids an experience with the game. But when you were playing, you just couldn't beat the high, the natural high that the game gives you. And I never really experienced that to the same extent in other sports. Even football, you run a play, and then you get 30 seconds to a half hour, and you go to sleep and have a nap and have a little lunch, and then you run another play. And that's not totally fair to say, but it's a slower game. And I know the differences, between box lacrosse, and they call field lacrosse more like a chess game. And the speed of the box and the strategy of field. I found that, again, as that hybrid kind of thing, such a unique game experience that it was hard to shake as a player to be done with it. It really was.